In this video, we will be discussing the Chapter 3 of Peter Singer's Practical Ethics entitled Equality for Animals. So why did Peter Singer named his book Animal Liberation? So in 1975, Animal Liberation was published, and at that time there were different types of liberation movements such as women's liberation, black liberation, and gay liberation. These liberation movements were organized to change discriminatory laws and urged the government to support individuals' groups' interests. Singer pondered what is the basis of these liberation movements, suggested that there is also a need for an animal liberation movement. So that is where the title Animal Liberation Movement came from. When we think of liberation movements, they were all about equality. When we say about equality, it is about having the same rights. Like, for example, the women's liberation is all about seeking for equal rights and opportunities for women and also free women from oppression and male supremacy. However, equality does not mean having the same rights. For example, in sexism, others are seeking for equality for women and some are seeking for equality for men and women. They are not seeking the same rights. Singer proposes that equality is best understood in terms of the fundamental principle of equality, and that is the principle of equal consideration of interest. The principle of equal consideration of interest is to treat another being as equal to another, meaning to give both beings equal consideration of their own interests. According to Singer, the capacity of suffering and enjoyment is a prerequisite for having interest at all, a condition that must be satisfied before we can speak of interest in a meaningful way. The bottom line is that beings have interest just in case they are capable of suffering. Therefore, human and non-human animals have interests. Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation, changed the way people perceived animals. In this book, it is stated that racist and sexist views is the same as speciesism. Speciesism is the practice of treating members of one species as morally more important than the members of the same species. The concept of speciesism allowed humanity to become superior to animals and not acknowledge them as individuals but just as mere objects and instruments to fulfill their desires. According to Singer, animals and humans share an important equality, and that is the capacity to suffer or to enjoy their lives. Animals, like humans, should be given equal considerations and should be given rights suited for their own level of sentience. The view that animals share an important equality to humans is now out in the limelight. This is through the efforts of organizations like PETA, or People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and other animal advocates around the world. PETA is an animal rights organization established to defend the rights of animals under the simple principle that animals are not ours to experiment on, eat, use for entertainment, or abuse in any other way.
Racism and speciesism. The belief that issues about humans should always take precedence over issues about animals reflects a popular prejudice against taking the interests of animals seriously, a prejudice no better founded than the prejudice of white slave owners against taking seriously the interests of their African slaves. This principle of equality implies that our concern for others must not depend on what they are like or what abilities they possess, although precisely what this concern requires us to do may vary according to the characteristics of those affected by what we do. The principle also implies that the fact that beings are not members of our species or race does not entitle us to exploit them, and it similarly implies that the fact that other animals are less intelligent than we are does not mean that their interests may be discounted or disregarded. Many philosophers have advocated equal consideration of interests in some form or another as a basic moral principle. Few recognize that the principle has applications beyond our own species. One of those few was Jeremy Bentham, the founding father of modern utilitarianism. Please notice the quote below. In this passage, Bentham points to the capacity for suffering as the vital characteristic that entitles a being to equal consideration. The capacity for suffering is not just another characteristic like the capacity for language. Bentham is not saying that those who try to mark the line that determines whether the interests of a being should be considered have selected the wrong characteristic. The capacity for suffering and enjoying things is a prerequisite for having interest at all, a condition that must be satisfied before we can speak of interests in any meaningful way. It would be nonsense to say that it was not in the interest of a stone to be kicked by a child along the road. A stone does not have interest because it cannot suffer. Nothing that we can do to it could possibly make any difference to its welfare. A mouse, on the other hand, does have an interest in not being tormented because mice will suffer if they are treated in this way. If a being suffers, there can be no moral justification for refusing to take that suffering into consideration. No matter what the nature of the being, the principle of equality requires that the suffering be counted equally with the suffering of any other being. If a being is not capable of suffering or of experiencing enjoyment or happiness, there is nothing to be taken into account. This is why the limit of sentience is the only defensible boundary of concern for the interests of others. To mark this boundary by some characteristics like intelligence or rationality would be to mark it in an arbitrary way. Why not choose some other characteristic like skin color? Racists violate the principle of equality by giving greater weight to the interests of members of their own race when there is a clash between their interests and the interests of those of another race. The white racists who supported slavery typically did not give the suffering of Africans as much weight as they gave to the suffering of Europeans. Similarly, speciesists give greater weight to the interests of members of their own species when there is a clash between their interests and the interests of those of other species. Human speciesists do not accept that pain is as bad when it is felt by pigs or mice as when it is felt by humans. That, then, is really the gist of the argument for extending the principle of equality to non-human animals. But there may be some doubts about what this equality amounts to in practice. In particular, some people might say, surely, pain felt by a mouse just is not as bad as pain felt by a human. Humans have much greater awareness of what is happening to them, and this makes their suffering worse. You can't equate the suffering of a person dying slowly from cancer and a laboratory mouse undergoing the same fate. In the case described, the human cancer victim normally suffers more than the non-human cancer victim. This is in no way undermines the extension of equal consideration of interests to non-humans. It means, rather, that we must take care when we compare the interests of different species. In some situations, a member of some species will suffer more than a member of another species. In this case, we should still apply the principle of equal consideration of interests, but the result of doing so is, of course, to give priority to relieving the greater suffering.
In highly urbanized and modern societies, non-human animals are often regarded as food. In fact, the use of animals as food is one of the oldest and most widespread form of animal use. Moreover, it is also seen as the most basic form of animal use and is the foundation stone of an ethic that sees animals as things for humans to be used to meet their needs and interests. According to Singer, if animals count in their own rights, or use of animals for food becomes questionable. However, this is not the case for Inuits. This small group of people living in the northern part of the world are obliged to consume animals or else they will starve. Therefore, Inuit living can be a reasonable claim that humans' interest of surviving overrides that of the animals they kill. However, most people cannot defend their use of animals for food the way Inuits do. The reason is that in today's industrialized world, almost anyone can maintain a healthy life without the need to consume animal products, like the vegetarians. In addition, meat is not necessary for good health and longevity. Moreover, animal production is not considered an efficient way in producing food since most of the animals are being fattened using beans and grains that could have been taken directly by humans. The nutritional value of animal meat for human consumption is only about one-fourth of the total nutritional value that we could gain if we directly consume these grains. The point is that animals are either not for health benefits or to increase the supply of food, but rather, most people like the way it tastes. The case against using animals for food is at its strongest if the animals were first subjected to inhumane way of killing before their flesh can be made available. This is common in modern farming industries that uses intensive farming as well as science and technology to the attitude that animals are objects for humans to use. Moreover, competition in the market forces meat producers to cut down the production costs, resulting to cramped spaces and unsuitable conditions for the duration of the animals' lives. They are treated like machines that convert fodder to flesh, and any innovation that results to a higher conversion ratio is highly adopted even if it causes animal cruelty. Thus, to avoid speciesism, all of these inhumane practices must be stopped. That means that humans should not eat meat unless they know the process and methods on how it was produced. These concerns about animal suffering in factories does not mean that all humans should become vegan, because it is possible to buy meat products or eggs that are from animals that are roaming freely. For example, the cage-free or the range-free chickens. Also, it is better to buy organic products. The label organic means that the animals have access to the outdoors, but the interpretation is sometimes loose. Nevertheless, the lives of the free-range animals are better than those in the animal rearing factories that are imprisoned in cramped spaces. However, it is still doubtful if using animals as food is compatible with the equal consideration of interest because it involves killing. Apart from killing, there are also a whole lot of processes before meat arrives in the dinner table, such as castration, separation from the mother, breaking up of herds, branding, transporting, slaughter, handling, and slaughtering. All of these involve suffering and do not take into account the interest of animals. The important question is not whether the animal products should be produced without suffering, but whether those products we are consider buying were produced without suffering. The principle of equal consideration of interest implies that their production wrongly sacrificed the important interest of animals to satisfy the less important interest of humans, unless it is proven to be produced without suffering. The cruelty system of producing animals is wrong. To buy and support these processes of production is the same as supporting animal cruelty and disregarding the interest of animals.
Experimenting on animals. Speciesism is mainly evident in using animals as test subjects in experiments, which is justified by the claim that this will lead to discoveries about humans. Humans comfortably believe that the suffering induced to the animals in the conduct of the experiment is put on a worthy cause. LD 50 test, a lethal dose of consumption that will make 50% of animal specimens die. Botox cosmetic, anti-wrinkling treatment, which are tested on mice on varying doses, which, if the dose is high enough, can inflict respiratory paralysis to the organism. University researches and experiments using animals as test subjects. These experiments failed to give non-human animals equal consideration of interests similar to human beings, because in doing these experiments, the benefit to humans can be none or uncertain. However, the suffering of the animals involved is real and there. So, what if these experiments that sacrifices few animals can save millions of human lives? Using the equal consideration of interest argument, the justifiable answer should be in accordance with the interest of many. Other anti-speciesists may argue that cognitively incapable human individuals with no family may have no more than self-awareness to those non-human animals. Then, why aren't they used as test subjects for experiments? Experimenters in this case imply a speciesist's attitude towards this proposed subject, as they would think it is inhumane and immoral to do so. Animal experimentation can only be justified when it is when it does not violate the principle of equal consideration of interest. It is also justified using a utilitarian lens that if the suffering of a small group of beings, either human or non-human, can alleviate the lives of the majority, then the action is moral. Although the most appropriate action and what we must strive to achieve should be developing a mode of experiment that do not make anyone suffer regardless of the species. Other forms of speciesism. Singer also points out other forms of speciesism in which he thinks that principle of equal consideration also applies. Fur trades. High-end brands such as Gucci, Chanel, Versace have announced fur-free policy and decided to look for alternatives. Technological advancements have helped devise fur-like materials for clothing so that animal cruelty can be prevented. But before this, fur factory farms were rampant. Animals stayed in cramped cages, depriving them the ability to engage in natural behavior. Animals are gassed, bludgeoned, anally electrocuted, and skinned alive. Circuses, rodeos, and zoos. Animals have also been seen as a form of entertainment for humans. Animals are forced to perform confusing and physically demanding tricks, causing countless animals to be injured and died. Marine parks and aquariums also prevent aquatic organisms from engaging in natural behavior and natural environment. Pet stores. Pet stores have been controversial due to the presence of breeding facilities. Animals are confined in plastic bins and are stacked in shelves as if they are lifeless packages. Animals are also kept under unsanitary conditions, which results in spread of diseases. However, instead of providing veterinary care, sick animals are sold or are disposed of in inhumane manner.
One might argue that intellectual and cognitive capabilities must be the basis of one's moral dominion. In this case, intellectually disabled human beings fall short of this criterion, making them at the same level of most of the non-human animals or even lower. This includes subhumans such as mentally retarded individuals, infants, and those in an unconscious state. Then, should we treat them with inferiority similar to their non-human counterparts? This often leads to a slippery slope argument which can only be stopped with a firm response. It is to provide a specific and unambiguous line that separates humans from other animals, that is, by looking at the species. This clear distinction between human and non-human animals puts us in an hierarchy within the animal kingdom, with us being on the apex. The justification of speciesism gives emphasis on the moral significance of every Homo sapiens regardless of the qualities each possesses. However, this special privilege is often subjected to abuse and misuse. Some people take advantage of this status to justify their mistreatment of non-human animals. This is a societal concern which must be governed accordingly by political laws. Peter Singer stresses that his point is not about degrading the moral status of the intellectually disabled humans, but to elevate the pedestal of animal rights, to rethink and reflect how we treat them, not to be apathetic to the intellectually disabled humans because they have equal self-awareness than that of the non-human animals, but rather for us to show greater concern to non-human animals because they are cognitively similar to intellectually disabled humans and have the same capacity to feel pain. This argument of speciesism paves the way to promote equality among humans. Speciesism is an intrinsic morality as we tend to treat beings of our own species better than those that do not belong in our group. This includes treating other individuals with subhuman characteristics the way we treat normal human beings, as it is the most moral or humane thing to do. And if we grant special rights for humans separate to those non-human animals, then we must treat every human equal, regardless of the race, sex, and other characteristics. This suggestion, in one way or another, promotes equality and empathy towards our fellow human beings. Contrary to the former statements, Some humans have higher affection towards non-human animals or objects rather than their fellow human beings, and there is no known rule that prohibits this kind of behavior. This is how affection can outweigh speciesism. One might have a closer relationship with their pets than their neighbors. However, when our moral judgment will be tested by a certain incidence that allows us to choose only one to save, what must govern our decision? Speciesism would suggest that the neighbor, as a fellow human, will have the higher priority regardless of our feelings towards them. Another defense to speciesism is the human prejudice by British philosopher Bernard Williams. Williams asserted that our values are necessarily human values in a sense that they are molded, articulated, and put into practice by human beings. However, these values are not limited to only humans, such that we may show concern and compassion for other non-human beings. There is nothing in our human nature that tells us how non-human animals should be treated, or should they be treated inferior to our kind. In this sense, Williams stated that there is nothing in our human outlook to not be concerned, and not to show value to other beings' pains, pleasures, and lives. So when confronted with the moral dilemma of choosing which side should we take, either our own group or the other, the most plausible response should be the side that is right.
At this point, we may be convinced that animals deserve to have rights like us humans do. But most of the people back then didn't agree with this due to various reasons. Peter Singer identifies 4 major objections to equality for animals. So how do we know that animals can feel pain? As human beings, we know or assume that other human beings feel pain according to the way they behave, because we do not have the ability to directly feel the pain they are experiencing. For example, a child falls off the swing and scrapes their knee. We can tell that the child feels pain by the way they behave or act. The child cries, rubs the sore spot, or just directly tells that they're in pain. Singer argues that animals feel pain like how humans feel pain. Their behavior is sufficient justification for the belief that they feel pain because unlike humans, they cannot talk and tell directly what they feel. Singer insists that this is the same with human babies and toddlers that still cannot talk. Babies and infants find ways to make their inner states and feelings apparent despite the lack of use of verbal communication. However, this argument is not applicable with all types of animals. Vertebrates such as mammals and birds are inferred to have the same nervous system structures with humans. The anatomical similarity suggests that vertebrates' ability to feel is similar to ours. On the other hand, the nervous system of invertebrates are less similar to humans, so we cannot really justify that they can feel pain. A capacity for pain or any other form of consciousness appears unlikely in bivalves, such as oysters, mussel, and clams, and if this is the case, the principle of equal consideration of interest will not apply to them. However, there are studies that have shown that crabs and prawns react to electric shocks, which implies that they can also feel pain, and mollusks, especially octopus, can solve novel problems on their own. The next objection is that if animals eat each other, so why shouldn't we eat them? This is also called the Benjamin Franklin objection. This is rooted from Franklin's realization that if animals eat each other, then why should not humans eat animals? This sparks the argument that animals eat other animals because they have to for survival. Animals don't have the capacity to be rational, to think, and to have a choice. Thus, this means that they do not deserve to be killed or treated in a similar way just because they kill or eat other animals. While us humans have the capacity to look for alternatives and be reasonable creatures, we have the ability to evade primal urges. Thus, we do not really need to eat animals to survive. The Darwinian survival of the fittest supports the fact that eating animals is just a part of nature in which the stronger prey on the weaker. Thus, not all animals deserve to be eaten, but rather only the weaker ones than us.
The factual mistake and error in reasoning. The factual mistake lies in the assumption that our own consumption of animals is part of some natural evolutionary process. This may be true for those who still hunt for food, but it has nothing to do with the factory farming of domestic animals. Error of reasoning comes when we think that eating animals is part of the natural process and we cannot interfere with it. It is a mistake to assume that the natural ways of doing things cannot be changed or developed. Based on this, we can accept that eating animals is natural, but that does not mean that it is absolute and cannot be changed.
Ethics and reciprocity. Scholars, philosophers, and critics argue that animals should be excluded from the sphere of ethics. If the basis of ethics is that I refrain from doing nasty things to others as long as they don't do nasty things to me, and I have no reason to avoid doing nasty things to those who are incapable of appreciating my restraint and controlling their conduct towards me accordingly. Animals cannot reciprocate the restraint and respect you have for them. In the case of shark attacks, your respect for their interest of animals will not save you from being eaten. However, Singer argues that ethics should not be all about self-interest. Infants, toddlers, and intellectually disabled persons are also not capable of reciprocating. So, does that mean we have to treat them unequally? Thus, according to Singer, we have to revise our ethical judgments. Differences between humans and animals. Humans and animals are not of different kinds. This claim is supported by the following. Darwin's discovery of the origin of humans argued that the difference between humans and animals is only of one degree, rather of a kind. So both humans and animals are capable of utilizing and making tools. Galapagos woodpeckers used cactus thorn to dig insects out of the crevices of the trees. Jane Goodall also discovered that the chimpanzees in the jungles of Tanzania chew leaves to make sponge, to sop up water, and use branches to make tools for catching insects. The use of language is a strong argument, but now chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans are able to use sign language, and parrots are able to speak. However, even if this fitted the facts, this would not still carry the moral weight required to justify our treatments of animals. Even if they do not speak or use language or use tools just like humans, it cannot be used as reason to ignore their pain and suffering.
Does the fact that being is self-aware entitle that being to some kind of priority of consideration? So some philosophers have claimed that there is a deeper difference between humans and animals. Animals cannot think, reason out, they have no conception and no self-awareness. Animals do not see themselves as distinct entities, they have no autonomy, and they do not have the ability to choose how to live their lives. However, Singer argues that self-aware beings should not be considered as superior and more valuable. He said that there are humans that are intellectually disabled, which hinders their capacity to become self-aware and have autonomy. Considering this, intellectually disabled persons should deserve the treatment and rights that animals have, which is entirely wrong.
For 47 years, animal equality has been a successful movement. Laws had been passed for animal protection throughout the world. In the Philippines, there are several actions that protect and promote animal equality, such as the Republic Act No. 8485, also known as the Animal Welfare Act of 1998, the Philippine Animal Welfare Society, and the University of the Philippines Manila Institutional Animal Care Use for Research Committee. The Animal Welfare Act of 1998 has the purpose to protect and promote the welfare of all animals in the Philippines by supervising and regulating establishments and operation of all facilities utilized for breeding, maintaining, keeping, treating, or training of all animals as object for trade and household pets. On the other hand, the Philippine Animal Welfare Society or PAWS is a non-profit organization that promotes animal welfare and protection of all animals with a vision of a Philippine that respects animals, practice responsible pet ownership, and protect wildlife. Lastly is the UP Manila Institutional Animal Care Use for Research Committee. This committee assures ethical and legal use of animals in research, as well as promote humane care and use of animals in terms of deciding on the needs of animals, the choice of species, and the number of animals needed for research. In the field of fisheries, there is this called the most humane way of killing a fish, which originated from Japan. It is called ikejime. This method shortens the struggle of the fish before it dies. This method includes the pithing of the brain to shut down the brain activity of the fish so that it won't feel pain anymore. Thank you everyone for lending your time to listen to our presentation, and I hope you have learned something from this report.